Hello, welcome to part 3 of my Suzuki GS550 Cafe Racer project. Today I'm making a bracket to mount a Daytona 80mm gauge to the top yoke, and in this video I'm going to show you how I've made it using only a few basic workshop tools. I'll include all the different steps, including the initial design on paper, transferring that design to aluminium plate, cutting, filing, polishing and fitting to the bike. If you'd like to follow the progress of the project, you can do that by clicking the subscribe button. So the first thing I'm going to do is head over to the bench and start drawing the design on paper. As you can see from the design, it's a basic bracket, but I think the gauge is going to be in a really nice position. I'm now going to take the measurements from the drawing and transfer the design to a piece of 3mm aluminium plate using a scribe. If I need to scribe any lines inside the area of the bracket, I'm going to be really careful to do it very lightly so I can sand them out later on. In this next stage, I'll be using a grinder with a metal cutting disc and a hacksaw to cut around the outline of the bracket. I'm going to be leaving around 1mm of metal outside each of the scribed lines, and that's because in the next step of the process, I'm going to be filing a nice neat edge exactly to those lines. Using a variety of different metal files, I'm now going to file the edges of the bracket down to the scribe lines. I'll be keeping the file at 90 degrees to the face of the bracket to ensure a nice square edge. Rather than sharp angled edges, I much prefer rounded ones, so I'm going to scribe around the rounded part of the bracket that came with the gauge. I'm then going to use a file to remove the metal to create the rounded edges. I'm now going to mark and drill the holes to mount the gauge to the bracket. The distance between the centres of the holes for the bolts I measured was 45mm, so I'm going to use the centre point and the horizontal scribe line that I marked earlier and make a mark 22.5mm on both sides from the centre. I'm then going to use a centre punch to mark the position for drilling. So I'm now going to mark the position of the holes which will be used to mount the bracket to the yoke using M6 bolts. The distance between the bolt hole centres on the yoke is 58mm. Marking the position of these holes is slightly more involved than that of the other two, and it's vitally important that they're in exactly the right place so the bracket's centred and square on the yoke. I'm now ready to test fit the bracket to the yoke and the gauge to the bracket. I've noticed the bolts were a little bit tight in the yoke, so I'm going to use an M6 tap to tap both of the holes before assembling the parts. looking at the bracket fitted to the yoke, you can see that it's exactly central and square. So I'm now going to fit it to the bike to see what it looks like. The gauge is in exactly the position I wanted it to be. It's angled slightly upwards, so when I'm sitting on the bike I'm looking down at the gauge, which is great. The wiring sits nicely underneath the gauge, and I'll be incorporating that into the loop when I work on the electrics. I can also operate the 2 push buttons on the back of the gauge. The 4 bolts I'm going to replace with flanged cap screws, as they just don't look right. I'm also not happy with the shape of the top part of the bracket, so I'm going to mark an arc that follows the edge of the gauge, and then I'm going to file down the metal. I'm much happy with the shape of the bracket now, so I'm going to move on to the next stage of removing the lines I scribed into the metal, removing the rough edges from the filing and any other imperfections. I'm going to do this using wet and dry, starting with 320 grit, then moving up to 400, then 600, then skipping to 2000 and 2500 for final finish. Every 30 seconds or so I'll be washing off the metal that's captured in the sanding sheet, and occasionally adding some WD-40 to make the sanding easier. With a nice smooth face and edges, I'm now going to move on to polishing the bracket using Autosol metal polish. It's a fantastic product, it makes polishing by hand really easy, and it leaves a great finish. I'll be adding a pea-sized bit of paste and then using a soft cloth to polish the surface and the edges. So that's work on this bracket complete. I'll be wiring the gauge up in a future video, so if you would like to see that and follow this Cafe Racer project, you can do that by clicking on the subscribe button. Thank you for watching. Cheers.